Today we're visiting one of my favourite museums in London. It's the Royal Air Force Museum, or the RAF Hendon. It's made up of 5 buildings and that's split into 6 hangars. First hangar here as you come in is a medley of aviation history and modern RAF. There's a mixture of different devices and uniforms, helmets, planes, and in this section mostly real planes. There's about 100 aircraft, does change all the time. As you'll see, the hangars are very closely filled and sometimes the planes are almost interlocking with each other, but they still manage to extract them, move them out and either send them for repairs or send them to their other museum up in Cosford. Here's a paveway. It's a nuclear missile, various types of bombs and munitions from the last 60 years. Unfortunately, the ME-262 Sturmvogel wasn't here when I visited, and I did ask, and the closest I got was it had gone to Cosford, but it's a beautiful plane which it's very hard to actually see an original. So here you can see a Spitfire. There's actually a Spitfire out front as well. Here are various forms of aerial photography. There's a lot of stands about different roles within the Air Force and uniforms from different eras and parts of the Air Force. The museum tries to cover the range of what they're actually doing as an Air Force, as well as the history. So here, for example, you have the different sizes of the RAF. You can see much smaller than it used to be. And at the same time, the different roles within the RAF. So here you can see the Red Arrows, you can see the Royal Air Force Rescue Helicopter, the Sea King. There's a pallet which is dropped for aid supplies. And then there's various vehicles for starting planes, towing planes, transporting staff around. They've recently moved this here. It's the Martin Baker ejector seats, and it covers the evolution of ejector seats. It used to actually be in Hangar 6, nearer to the Phantom and the Lancaster bomber, but that hangar is a little bit of a mess at the moment when I visited here in January 2025. They have an SE6B, I believe that is a replica. The RAF stories told here with various historical items and paraphernalia, along with some examples of planes. So you have the Dart, the Mosquito, the Canberra, Panvia Tornado, and a Eurofighter at the end there. This section's a mixed introduction leading into the interactive display, the RAF of the Future, which is the modern offering. About 5 years ago they opened this section, replacing what I think was a more effective, more manual, so less computers, but actually children found it a lot more engaging, explaining flight and what the RAF do. Interesting launch there from the RAF. There's some larger launches out the side. Unfortunately, they're covered up for the winter. Here's a Spitfire, early stage Spitfire, maybe a Mark 1 or Mark 2. Some interesting models of different planes here. And if you want to see, these are all seaplanes. If you want to see seaplanes, I'd suggest going to Yeovil Naval Airspace Museum, and here's various sonar buoys and systems like that's a tracking system off an AWACS plane. Mera launch, which was used for towing targets, and also some of the bigger ones were used for actually rescuing RAF who've been down. Over there you can see the fowl and gnat of the Red Arrows. They're actually running out of airframes. The British have never used actual combat planes for aerobatics, always used training planes. With the cost of modern planes, wouldn't really be looking to use fighter planes. So the likes of the Eurofighter or the F-35, not really up for use. So running out of airframes, and it looks like in the next 10 years the Red Arrows will have to close. There has been some debate, but Parliament and successive Defence Secretaries don't seem to have come to a conclusion. And there's various armoured cars and equipment representing the RAF regiment, because the RAF has effectively an army regiment which guards the bases and makes sure that there's safety on the ground, as well as things like the fire service there that's represented with this uniform. Here we have Westland Sea King, beautiful helicopter used for search and rescue. If you ever see footage of Prince William flying as coastal protection, life-saving, this is the aircraft that he flew. Up there you can see, I think it's F-22, that's a model. There's no current service planes in the RAF museums for obvious reasons, and the other ones have actually been stripped of parts. Occasionally you can see inside a cabin, and they're generally missing most of the dials. But it's lovely to be able to get so close up to this, and you can see it's got a ship's hull effectively underneath. There's the winch for lifting people up and down. You can see inside. It's fairly close to what the real helicopter would look like, but rather difficult to do with the camera. But quite interesting, sort of a large minibus size. Here again the Red Arrows. It's an old airframe. Get a nice view of it close up. Whenever you see them with yellow, it's generally a training aircraft, although with the helicopters it does include search and rescue. Here's one of the rockets that Whittle designed, the one we're just walking past, which it's the engine from the Gloucester Meteor. They're instantly recognisable here, the engine from the Harrier jump jet. You can see the 4 outputs, and those outlets were used for vectored thrusting. And there's a beautiful Merlin engine there, which you pretty much all the British Second World War planes that you see in this museum have the Merlin of one type or another. Here we have a model of the F-35B Lightning. You can see the weapons bays there, and as I turn back you can kind of see the scoop, well probably not the scoop on the top of the fan. Here's a nice model of it again, and that is a model, the big one's a model as well. But there's a good explanation of the Lightning and the different forms. Here there's interactive displays which kids certainly enjoy, where you can vote on the ethics of drone warfare. You can look at various intelligence, and if they're working you can call in a mission, do the mission, set the target to attack and attack it. And then there's an ethical debate here in the middle. Very interesting afterwards, the models explaining the different types of development, why the wings and structures of fuselage are different, and some real models that were used for flight testing real planes. So the first one here, you have the twin float biplane, and on the side you can see a range of real RAF planes that never quite happened, flight targets, models for various aircraft that were experimented on and never came into service or were maybe trialled out briefly. It's an interesting section, but there's Panvia Tornado, but with an odd body shape. But I would say, I think children actually preferred the old section where you could fly a hang glider, you could simulate an aid drop. Here's a Gloucester Javelin model form. Sadly, this one you can normally go inside, but for some reason it was closed all day when I was here. You climb in through a small cage to check that you're capable of getting through the aircraft, and going on the other side. And then you can walk through the main cabin and you can see the insides of this short Sunderland flying plane, which is a really beautiful plane. Very well preserved. One of the staff I talked to said he wondered how it got inside the building, and I suggested it might have been there before the building was built, because this has been here as long as I can remember. This hangar used to be the Battle of Britain hangar before they had a reorganisation a few years ago. But you can see a very large, immense plane. Really beautiful example. Probably the only short Sunderland I can think of in a museum. And the only one you can actually go inside. You can see there where they could winch out the mines and drop them. At the front you can actually make out the platforms that you could climb on to service the engines out at sea. And it really is very small inside considering how big it is. Leaving Hangar 1, we make our way over to the early flight section. We're walking past these two RAF launchers from the Second World War. They always look a little sad, dejected and left behind here. Unfortunately completely covered for the winter, but in the summer months those steps are open. You can walk up and you can see onto the deck. They were used for mainly rescuing pilots from the Channel during the Battle of Britain, also towing targets, getting to places quickly, and just general coastal patrol for the RAF. And there's Hangar 1 we've just come out of. We're heading towards this building here, which is Hangar 2, which is flight from the First World War. The silver building in the middle is the final Hangar 6, and Hangars 4 and 5 are the white building at the far end. Hendon was actually an RAF base and airfield, and before that it was an airfield, and there was the grey and white Aviation company was based here, and this was their main building. I believe the hangar is the original hangar. The aircraft, it's very hard to tell which ones are genuine and which ones are models. The propeller blade there is from Blériot's plane, which flew over the Channel, landed just next to Dover Castle. I assume it's the propeller blade. And here is a trophy from some pre-war competitions. There's a good display, good explanation of the origins of the airfield, and then you through into the main hangar. There is a room upstairs which is a recreation of Graham White's office. I've skipped that because it's not really much time. We're going to run out of time on this video. This is a Blériot 27, a pre-war plane built mainly for racing and competition, not a military plane, but it shows you the kind of state of art in its day. Very small, very light, starting to develop aerodynamics, but that is actually linen which has been stretched over wooden ribs, mixed in with a bit of glue and dried so it becomes rigid. Here's a beautiful example of an Avro 504K. And Avro actually lasted a very long way after the war, but now long gone, sadly. Here's an interesting piece. It's a bit of machinery for shaping the propellers, because the propellers were basically layers of strong hard wood pressed and glued together and then carved, so it wasn't just one piece of wood carved into a shape, but it had to actually be pressed into place. Here's a interactive display. You can touch the different types of material in it. Again, this is a wooden frame with Irish linen on it. And you can start to see the development of RAF with the RAF roundels, and at that point the rear fin was all in the red, white and blue. Here are some key engines from the First World War with a series of displays. There's one that explains how they used to shoot through the propeller, which is quite good. There you can see a Caudron G5. That was a training and reconnaissance plane. Very famous mainly because of its shape. I think it's called a sequential plane. Behind that is a model you can sit in where when you move the controller you can see the effect of the yaw and pitch, and quite a good explanation of how basic controls work on a plane. Along the wall there some photos of pilots from the First World War, and you can see how many 9,349 died out of the 313 who served by the end of the war. Up there you can see the basket of a First World War balloon. Here a Sopwith triplane, I believe that's an original because there's the reefs there. It is sadly a bit difficult to tell which of these planes are incredibly rare originals and which ones are replicas, and I would say that's not accidental because it could have been achieved quite easily. That's a Royal Aircraft Factory FE2B. There was an A, a B and a C, different configurations, but they're all a pusher. That's with the engine at the back. Here's a Bristol F2B, more sophisticated later war plane, beautiful piece of equipment, and actually an original, I believe. You can see how it's developed from those early planes. Just in the course of the First World War, really in 3 or 4 years, they changed substantially. There's a Sopwith Camel. Over there's an Albatross, the sort of yellowish coloured one. It's a wooden shelled plane, very striking. Anyone who built model aircraft would recognise it as one of the 3 or 4 planes that Airfix always had. So Fokker D7, very interesting paint scheme. You can see the experimentation with camouflage where the British generally went for a rather drab army green, whereas the Germans went for a more dazzling mixture of colours. Here's the Albatross, very beautiful example, and I believe this is a genuine plane. Don't think any of these are serviceable today. I believe at the Shuttleworth collection there's very similar aircraft that you can actually see flying, and I'm certainly intending to go there in the not too distant future, so we'll find out. But very sophisticated plane compared to earlier on. I'll just dwell a little bit here on the Albatross and the Fokker there. So they're very striking planes, quite iconic for their era and very rare to see. A Sopwith biplane. As we come round here, it's the Royal Aircraft Factory RE8. That was a bomber and reconnaissance plane. And you look at it and you might think, where do the bombs go? Because obviously there's no bomb bay. There's nothing to hang a rack on because those wings are literally thin wood covered very tightly with linen. But actually on the right here you can just about make out in this video a bomb rack there, and you could release bombs from that, and also the gunner would also control the Twin Vickers machine gun at the back. You can see the rack there better, and there's a wheel on the end so you could turn that wheel and release them. You had the machine guns on the side which fired between the propellers using a mechanism. There was a scope there at the front, and they're the, not exactly co-pilot, but effectively the bomber and gunner would use that machine gun at the back. Here's the Royal Aircraft Factory FE2B and a replica of the Vickers VB5. Some interesting material from the First World War. I'll just kind of skim past in terms of uniforms, paintings. There was a piece of munition there. I believe that's a Bristol F2B. It's a very interesting hangar, although there's quite a few which are replicas or composites, and I would say it's not as clear as it should be. I don't know anywhere else with such an excellent collection of First World War and pre-war planes, especially that it contains all the iconic ones like the Dolphin, the Sopwith Pup, the Fokker, the triplanes. So really nice, and a Codron as well. Coming out of Hangar 2, there's a lovely little children's playground there, very kind of aviation and Hendon themed. A nice break from the slog if you're bringing kids here, and kids certainly love this museum. Building to the left there, the brick one, is a cafe, and there's a fairly reasonably priced, decent sized meals there. Just behind those trees is the main line, the Western Main Line, and behind that's the M1, so it's very easy to get here. Parking is charged by, I think it's £7 for 3 hours, £10 for more than 3 hours. Parking nearby is next to impossible. There is a train station nearby, but the tube is currently closed for renovation. As you enter the next hangar, there's a Sierra C30. We knew it as the Avro Rotor. It's an autogyro, so a precursor of a helicopter. The blades on top create lift and can allow it to hover, but they don't allow it to move backwards and forwards. There's no pitching and throttling on the blades, and forward motions carried out more like a plane. As we come in, there's a propeller starter, an engine starter from Graham White from the original factory here, and a Hawker Hart. Hawker Hart was an interwar plane, very wide service within the RAF, particularly in Mesopotamia is where I've seen photos of it. Here's a Napier engine, precursor of the Merlin in the Supermarine S9B. That's the plane from which the Supermarine Spitfire evolved. If you want to see the Supermarine 9B, check out my second video at the Science Museum. It is a little bit ragged and looking its age, but it's an iconic aircraft amongst people who like aircraft. Here's a Bristol Bulldog from the 1920s, the kind of Eurofighter of its day, frontline fighter, still very much a First World War creature, but very interesting to actually see one. And here's some Air Vice Marshal memorabilia. Over in the corner here is coverage of the lapel badges, the different ranks, the positions, a little bit about fire as well. Obviously they have the RAF regiment and they have the fire service. Not everyone's flying planes, and there is a little display on that if you think back to the first hangar. Here's the cabin of, I think it's the R100. It was a British airship, same time as the Graf Zeppelin, but met a very similar fate, I'm afraid. Here's a gun carriage. So it's effectively a cannon with the turning mechanism that could be inserted in the back of the Hawker Hart there. And there's some interesting guns and photographic reconnaissance equipment from that sort of interwar period, along with some bombs and good explanation. Lovely model here of a Supermarine Spitfire. I would guess 1/8 scale. It is pretty large. They used to have the one, if you remember the advert from the 1990s, with the aircraft being made up of various tools like floppy drives and USB keys and spanners. That used to be on display here, seems to have gone. That's a fueling tanker. And I think that's a rocker, I seem to think, or a skua. And there's the cannon from the back. You can see a rather substantial gun there. But this is another interwar, interwar biplane. And various uniforms. Some very good explanations of different elements, highlighting elements of the RAF and its history. And they're all significant pieces. If you're in the RAF or you know someone who's been in the RAF, you might want to pause there, see if you could spot their squadron emblem. There's a nice display of, I believe it's the current ones, because over the years I'm sure there's been a lot more than that. Again, you can see the cabin of the airship there as we make our way round to the Supermarine Southampton, which, although it's only a fuselage, really is quite a spectacular piece. You're talking about an interwar seaplane. It was the most common probably of its time. I think people mainly remember the Walrus, which was much smaller, or the Short Sunderland because of its sheer scale, but Southampton was quite a successful seaplane in its day for the RAF, and without mid-air refueling, if you want to fly around the world, the option to get to, say, the Middle East is to land in every country on the way, or to be able to land on the sea. And if you've got a large navy, obviously landing on the sea you can refuel, and it was a very successful plane for its era. It's beautiful. You can actually go all the way around it, and there's steps up so you can walk alongside of the craft, and you can see it really is varnished wood. So we're starting to move away from the timber frame with linen stretched over it, and it's almost like a ship. It's got very ship-like nautical, let's say, lines. And from up here you can actually see they've cut through cross sections, so you can see they have a little white stirrups there to help you climb in, and the open cockpit, and they're very open. Even the cables for controlling the ailerons and the rudder are really very visible when you have a look. So you've got the pilot and co-pilot there, and then further back you've got gunners, and there's actually a passage in that fuselage, not massively big. I wouldn't enjoy moving around that if it was in a heavy swell, but a very interesting piece. I think if you like seaplanes or naval aviation, then the museum to go to in Britain is the Fleet Air Arm Museum down in Yeovil. From up here you can see I think it's a Humber staff car, and there's a series of planes here. I think that's the Tempest. I always confuse the Tempest and Typhoon. The Hurricane was evolved to be replaced with the Typhoon. The Typhoon had issues with the quality of the flight airframe, didn't really work as a fighter, so it evolved through to the Tempest. I believe this is a Tempest, so you can see there the rockets, sort of late war ground attack, because the Tempest and Typhoon were used as fighter bombers. And they're the black and white stripes. We'll see them on a few planes here. That's Overlord stripes. So to help people on the ground recognise Allied forces in D-Day, for the whole D-Day campaign, they painted black and white stripes on the wings and the rear of the fuselage so that you could instantly recognise. And we can see as we turn around the Slingsby Cadet. That was the sort of first training aircraft as a glider from the 1950s through till 1986. Very basic, very simple kind of first plane for budding pilots in the RAF. Here's a late Supermarine Spitfire. I think it's a 14. I actually thought they stopped at about 10 or 12, but you could tell it's a late form. It's got 4 blades, it's got clipped wings, there's a scoop under the centre of the engine there because there was, I believe, supercharging on the Merlin engine, and it's a slightly different shape at the back, very similar to the iconic sort of Mark 1 through Mark 4 where you have the elliptical wings. Here's a North American Harvard, very common plane in British flight training. You could always tell yellow is the colour of trainers in the British Air Force, although you might have spotted the yellow helicopters earlier. That's because they're search and rescue. Here, very significant plane, Gloucester Gladiator, sadly in a terrible state. We entered the war with a lot of biplanes that really were horrifically out of date. When we had the first adventure in Scandinavia, where we were fighting the German invasion of Scandinavia, we lost a lot of those planes, and that one was pulled out of a lake. I think it was used on a Tirpitz raid. Here's a Taylorcraft Auster 1. They were used for reconnaissance and transporting around staff. Various engines here. That's the radar from the front of, I believe, a Phantom. Pretty substantial, some of these jet engines. This is the one from the Phantom. Phantom's in the background. I think we'll probably go back to that in a little while. I actually went on a Cold War tour on this visit, but didn't film it, with a member of staff who was serving in the RAF during the Cold War, and someone who actually flew on the Black Buck raid, but we'll get back to that. Here, probably the most famous of the RAF's bombers. This is actually a medium bomber, or heavy medium bomber. It's the Avro Lancaster, and you can see underneath it some examples of the bombs it could drop. It was basically a very large bomb truck, and it actually got Merlin engines, the same as I said, a lot of the planes we're going to see today. And you can see it's still very much a beast of the Second World War, with the heavy, large landing gear, 4 big engines. They're Merlins. A beautiful iconic plane. Over there we'll see in a little bit that it wasn't the best view today, the B-17. So here's beautiful Lancaster. There is actually one that's flying. I had the opportunity to see it last year, actually by accident, and you could see the Battle of Britain flight does fly one of these, not this one, but a very large, impressive plane. You can see a Grand Slam there. Over by the wall is actually one of the most famous munitions dropped from a Lancaster, which is the bouncing bomb that was designed to bring down the German dams in the Ruhr, and was supposed to cripple industrial capacity, but probably achieved more in terms of propaganda. I think it's a £22,000 bomb. Pretty big by its day, and that's actually the vehicle used for loading the bomb. Obviously you can't just carry them around. You need specialist equipment to lift something that heavy, that delicate and that explosive. You can see there, no enemy plane will fly over Reich territory. Something which Hermann Göring famously said before the war, and a lot of people believe led to the Battle of Britain moving to a blitz rather than attacking airfields. Here's a Messerschmitt Bf 110, Germany's probably best night fighter for most of the war. And here the beautiful Mosquito. It's a light bomber, very fast, very high. There's incendiaries. It was often used to drop them ahead of the bombers to kind of mark the way. And here's probably the largest aircraft inside this museum, the Vulcan bomber. The British designed 3 V bombers for the Cold War for nuclear bomb drops. We had the Vulcan, the Valiant and the Victor. You've got the Vulcan here, probably the most famous of the British V bombers. You might remember it from the James Bond film Thunderball. Here's an example of what the actual payload could be. So if it was non-nuclear weapons, it could carry all of those. And it was a monster of a plane. Could actually fly in at 100 foot at very high speeds and drop that payload. Standing underneath the bomb bay, it feels like you park a minibus in here, and it could basically drop a very large single nuclear bomb, which had accuracy of about half a mile because it dropped it very fast and very high so it could get away, or a huge payload. And one of the guys on the Cold War tour I was on was actually on the Black Buck raids, which Black Buck raid was the longest bombing raid ever, right up until the Cold War, when the B-52s did a 48-hour bombing run, I think. And when it actually happened, it was the Falklands War. We had to get planes to the Falklands quickly, and we didn't have runways nearby, obviously, because the ones there had been taken. And the Vulcan was coming out of service, so they'd actually come out of service 2 weeks earlier, and we didn't have the capacity to do what was urgently needed. So brought them back into service, and I think the mid-air refueling probe was actually taken from the RAF Cosford Museum one, replaced with a replica, and a lot of Gate Guardian bombers were sort of scavenged as well to get that working, because it was a very fuel-hungry aircraft, and it was a huge mission. There is an excellent book on the Black Buck raid. Here you can see actually how they climb up. The first ladder, you can't see this unless you're on the tour, this view, but the first ladder you climb up to get into where the navigators are, and then there's a second ladder up to where the pilot sits. And the two pilots, the pilot and co-pilot, had ejector seats. The rest didn't. They had to drop out through that hatch. So that hatch would be dropped down and a ladder folded to the side, and then they would have to basically roll out of it. I can't say that would appeal. Next to the Vulcan, you can see the front of a Valiant. The Valiants were built as bombers. They actually used an Arado wing design, and they were very good. They were very fast. They were excellent planes, but strategically it was chosen to use them as refueling planes because they were good at a higher speed, because they had a swept wing but not the V. They couldn't go as low as some of the bomb runs would need to be. An excellent plane. That's the front. You could see a drogue of it refueling, but actually that was normally the refueler itself. And you can see the probe sticking out the front now. That's the refueling probe. I think the Pito's over there as well. Next to the Valiant, there's a very good explanation of refueling and refueling process. Good examples of pieces of equipment like refueling pods. Unlike the American refueling system where the two planes actually lock and there's a connection, the way it works on the British jets of that era is they drop the drogue behind, and as that kind of flaps around and stabilizes, the plane behind very slowly catches up, slots the refueling nozzle into that sort of hoop, and it has to apply a forward pressure. So when it's pressing against it, the fuel flows back. So obviously very effective, but you do need to be millimetre perfect on your alignment, but also on actually the speed to maintain that speed, and it could refuel two at a time. And refueling capacity was really important back then, because the planes like the Lightning, we'll see in a little bit, the amount of fuel they used, they had to be refueled 3 times on a mission. Here's a Gloucester Meteor, the first jet fighter in the RAF. Beautiful example there, and you can see one of Frank Whittle's engines on the right there. Next to the Canberra, which it's actually still in service with NASA with a modified wing and engine, but very high altitude reconnaissance plane, and that particular one flew from London to Auckland. Was it Melbourne? Here, Vampire, beautiful twin boom, very unusual configuration. If you ever read Frederick Forsyth's book The Shepherd, it's about that. Here's a Jet Provost, side by side 2-seat trainer, used right through, I believe, to the 90s. And again, the red and white gives you the idea it's a trainer. Here's the BAC Lightning. It's basically two engines on top of each other with an immense fuel tank on the belly, rockets on the side, and a super thin wing. And we actually had the opportunity on the Cold War tour to walk underneath the wings, and they really are ridiculously thin. They're just thick enough to hold the wheels, and you can actually see through that window there down through where the engine was. They had fuel for about 15 or 20 minutes, so they would zip up, refuel, attack the bomber, refuel, maybe go back for another or fly back down to land. Then next to that, there's some late war, post-war ambulance and fire engine tender. And here's actually a hand-pulled fire pump. Here's the Hawker Hunter, really beautiful plane, the sort of Spitfire of the jet age, really elegant, fast, high-performing plane. Sort of 1950s, early 60s, like a Jaguar E-Type if it was a plane. And you can see their modular gun pod. So that's an Aiden cannon that could be slotted in and would fire at very high speed. It actually was a bit problematic because the bullets would hit the wings, so they had to put baskets. Just there on the right's that little rocket booster. That was sort of camber. Now, I've always assumed that was for takeoff, the way the B-52 and some versions of the American versions, the Hercules, have rockets to assist with super short takeoffs. Actually, it was to get higher altitude because of the way the engine breathed. It wasn't able to get to its total height without a little push. Here again, Meteor. Beautiful post-war jet, beginning of the jet age, really. Here's it. I said earlier I always confused the Tempest and the Typhoon. I believe this one's the Tempest. Effectively, the Tempest 2 became a Typhoon, which we saw in the Overlord stripes earlier. This is actually configured and painted for, it was a target tower, so it would tow a target so that people could shoot at it. Hence the very high vis colour. Fiat Falco, iconic Italian biplane, very early stages of the war. Really beautiful plane. Don't really get to see much of the Italian planes in aircraft museums. Pretty much all of them have that. On my left though, the BF-109, iconic Battle of Britain German fighter. There was a Focke-Wulf FW-190, the other iconic German plane, and actually the one they had in the next hangar there is the only two-seater version left in the world. But we're actually lending that back to a German museum in Berlin. So hopefully we'll be getting a 190 in return from somewhere. Considering the planes here often date back to World War II, there's a surprising amount of movement, change, evolution, lending, borrowing, repairing. So it does change as a collection a lot more often than you might think for a museum with 70, 80-year-old aircraft. Here's a Spitfire and a Hurricane, really beautiful examples, and a Kitty Hawk, much more famous for, this one's in the colours, it was an American plane that we bought I think on Lend-Lease, and there's a Thunderbolt, late war ground attack light bomber. Some memorabilia from the Sycamore, which you can kind of see in the background and we'll be getting over to shortly. You can see very nice examples. There is a Spitfire and a Hurricane outside as well. I assume they're composites, the ones outside. Certainly part of them isn't real. Everyone likes a Spitfire. I had the opportunity to go to the Battle of Britain Memorial Museum down on the south coast last year, and while I was there, Spitfire and Hurricane flew over purely by coincidence rather than design. So we make our way around here. You've got the Kitty Hawk. This is in the colours of the Desert Campaign, so probably Libya, this particular one. And you can see the shark's teeth, which are very famous for this plane. It's rare you see one without the eyes and the shark's teeth. Although as you go round to a very similar mouth configuration there, Tempest and the Typhoon, you don't really see it. Here's a Thunderbolt. Off the top of my head, I think that's in New Zealand or Australian colours. But not necessarily a beautiful plane, but a very large gun carriage. Here's a Chipmunk. This is actually the only aircraft in this museum which saw active service in the Cold War. We used to fly 2 of them out of Berlin, and they'd be used for pilot training, and of course none of that pilot training ever involved having a camera and taking photos of the Russian setup, but basically it was used to spy on the Russian zone whilst training people. So that one actually saw service, and that particular one also did a loop around the Arctic. Now here we're getting over into the helicopters. Here's a Westland Gazelle, used very much for reconnaissance and recovery of injured. Here's a Westland Whirlwind, the precursor of the Wessex, which we saw in the first hangar. There used to be a Westland Merlin here, or something in Augusta Westland, after Westland was sold off after the Westland scandal. There's actually a museum of helicopters down near Yeovil, and the Westland Merlin moved down there, and there's a very good collection of helicopters. Here's the Sikorsky R4, first mass-produced helicopter, and actually used by the Americans, manufactured 42 to 44, so 131 of them built. We had some, and a very early helicopter, probably still struggling to be useful, but used for reconnaissance and transport, and certainly a fascinating piece. It's not really something you see in many museums, and it's the sort of precursor of things like, here's the Westland Belvedere, this huge long helicopter, sort of a little bit like the Chinook, but you could see a fraction of the capacity, longer, fuselage is smaller, and the blades don't interlock the same way. I think the Chinook is supposed to be one of the most complicated machines in the world. It's got some millions of parts, literally in the millions, because the blades actually interlock, and the process of making sure that they interlock without a problem is not a simple one. And here you can see very interesting rear, because it's got the 2 rotors. It doesn't have the problem with auto rotation that helicopters have, which is why they have that at the back. Here's in the colours of the Royal Flight Westland Wessex. These fly out of RAF Norfolk, and it's the Queen's flight. It's now the King's flight, but you can see the ER2 insignia there. Used for short range transportation, and you always get the red and blue with a white strip colours, instantly recognisable, the Royal Flight. Kept very clean, not so combat looking as a lot of RAF aircraft. But a beautiful plane from its time. You can see that rear propeller or rear blades to stop auto rotation, that the blades go one way and the aircraft spins in the alternate. That pushes back against that. It's one of my favourite sections, the Beaufort and the Beaufighter side by side. You see here the Beaufighter light ground attack, often used for attacking ground targets. You can see those 4 holes in the front there for Aiden cannons like the one at the bottom. So very substantial firepower, very fast, very high. And if you see on the side of the engines those long exhausts, those are a special type of exhaust which reduces the flames from the exhaust. So they kind of smoke it off so that you don't see the sparks and flames of the exhaust, because this was often used as a night fighter. And I think these are really beautiful aircraft. And again, hopefully you know by now the Overlord stripes. But quite small, pretty heavily armed, packed a punch, flew very fast, and performed really well until it started coming up against later war German fighters. A really beautiful plane. Next to it, the Beaufighter. You can see this was used a lot by Naval Command, or Coastal Command it was called. And here's a spotlight which could literally be plugged in where one of the belly gun. So it would sit there, spotlight would be used and targeted to find U-boats so that they could then be bombed with torpedoes, and there's some examples of torpedoes underneath the plane. See, I think that's an 18-inch, very large torpedo there. There's also some smaller torpedoes, some examples of depth chargers. And you can see the very nice view out the front there, the glass canopy round and at the bottom is quite a decent view there, especially if you've got a spotlight halfway down the fuselage pointing ahead of you, lighting what you're aiming at. Nice collection of weapons on this. You can see the sort of payloads that it carried, and there's good explanations of all of them. Obviously they are predominantly inert. I did hear from one of the staff who told a story of how one of the aircraft turned up with the rockets were still armed, but I would suggest that's rather rare. It might just be an anecdote for the tourists. But beautiful plane. Next to it we have the Avro Anson. Now I think on the Thunderbolt I said it was Australian. It's not Australian. I did think there's something missing from the Australian insignia. That's actually an RAF plane from Southeast Asia Command from 42 to 46. Here you can see one of the gun turrets from the top, an example of how the gun actually works. So you have a glass dome covered gun emplacement with 2 large cannons, and then a person climbs in through the bottom of that, and it's on rails that can turn around. I think I was thrown a bit by the wallaby on the front, made me think it was Australian, but looking at the markings seems not. I mean, feel free to comment on that one. I'm quite intrigued. Here another ball turret, quite a different design, bolt and pull. One plane which is actually missing is the bolt and pull Defiant. Now we're sure there used to be one here. It was basically, think of a fighter jet where the bomber's gun emplacement had just been slapped in the back. good idea, didn't really work. Here's a Supermarine Stranraer. Again, Supermarine, very big name in flying boats, and then moved on from the S9B that won the Schneider Cup through to a derivative design which was the Spitfire. But beautiful example. You really don't see many flying boats because they pretty much were gone from military service after the war, and during the war a lot obviously got destroyed. Some beautiful models here of some of the RAF launchers. The RAF had a lot of launchers for rescuing sailors, towing targets, getting troops around. So quite important back in the day, having these launchers, a sort of period that's a bit forgotten today. I'm sure the RAF have some boats somewhere, but and here's some models of some key aircraft there. You can see the Fairy, the Sunderland, the Westland, Shackleton, Nimrod, I think Wellington at the back there. Is that Catalina? Some very interesting aircraft that aren't on hull here. And again, the BF-110 iconic plane. You can see the front radar system. It's called Christmas Tree. And again, we saw those on the, it's a night fighter. We saw those large exhausts to prevent the flames on, I think it was the Beaufort. Night fighter, very interesting paint job. We're moving round now to the bomber section. There's a fighter bomber. This is a Halifax. This actually crashed on a lake in Norway and then sank to the bottom when the ice broke, and was there for about 30 years. So incredibly fragile, not really repairable without replacing everything and creating a fake. So the museum keeps it as a exhibit of Halifax. Very rare plane, the Halifax. There was a lot built. Many people think that it was as good a design as the Lancaster in its day, but obviously this one's a very sad fellow. And the people who served on it, actually I believe their bodies were never found, so there's a small memorial to them there. And those engines, the guy who gave the Cold War tour claimed that they actually ran when they were pulled out, that they could be put back on and run. Again, guess what engine it is? Merlin's. But I remember when I saw this as a teenager thinking, oh, they'll be repairing this and when I come back. But no, it's just maintained in this exact state because it's a beautiful example, but really just not repairable. And even from the rear here you can recognise this plane, the Heinkel HE-111. It was called a wolf in sheep's clothing because it was designed to be a fairly minimalist, effectively a transport plane that wasn't very good at transporting things, but was actually a bomb truck. Saw very heavy service in the Spanish Civil War in the Condor Legion, and then in the Battle of Britain, famously the heavy bomber that was used over London. So if you ever see the film The Battle of Britain, you see quite a few of these. And they're actually genuine planes in that one. It was filmed at a time where there were still flying examples of a lot of the planes. There used to be a Battle of Britain section over in Hangar 1. It was quite a popular display, and it had this, the Heinkel, the Messerschmitt 110, the Spitfire, Hurricane, and the Stuka that we're going to see in a second. Sadly, in the middle, a lot of the planes are covered over as part of the moving them around, so you can't really see the Salamander, which is, or the Comet was a little bit obscured. And the Me-262 Sturmvogel, the first operational fighter bomber with a jet engine, has been moved up to Cosford. So I'm going to have to make a trip to Cosford because that's a very iconic plane. Here an explanation of the Battle of Britain in terms of number of pilots, number of casualties, number of aircraft available. And blimp towing aircraft. So the RAF were also responsible for putting up anti-aircraft balloons, and they'd be reeled out from the back there, and that would control the height. There's the Stuka, very iconic plane. Slightly confusing to me that the configuration with the plane and the colours seemed very much Battle of Britain. It was always in the Battle of Britain section. But the tank on the front seems to suggest to me that it's a later Stuka. Probably, well, I would think Russian front with that tank design. But very iconic dive bomber. If you see the film The Battle of Britain or the Barbarians at the Gate, you'll see them in action. So, miles Oxford, or miles airspeed. Bit of fuselage without the wings. Really, I think it's as much a way to show off the aircraft transport vehicle here. Quite an unusual piece to see. And obviously we used to recover crashed aircraft, so having that capacity was crucial to maintaining aircraft and recovering them or recycling them. There's some interesting memorials and historical pieces here. There's the American Air Force Memorial. Used to be a bigger section about the American Air Force next to the B-17. But you can see 350,000 Americans served in Britain in the 8th Air Force. There's actually an US 8th Air Force museum up at Duxford. Duxford's near Cambridge, whereas Cosford and Hendon are RAF. Duxford is Imperial War Museum. It's quite touching. The young crew who were on that Halifax, all of them lost without a trace. Just a handful of the millions of people who died in the Second World War, many of whom no real marked grave for. Avaranson multi-role aircraft, served in a lot of air forces around the world. We saw one of these at the Imperial War Museum. It's a piloted bomb, so a kamikaze bomb, Osaha. I mean, here, a very unique, or certainly to me, it's the Dina, the Mitsubishi Dina fighter bomber. Don't really get to see many Japanese planes at European Air Force museums, but a beautifully preserved example there. They don't have a Mitsubishi Zero Zen, unfortunately. The Kawasaki KI-100, was it Type 5, I think? Didn't actually get designated a name the way that the Dina did, or the Zero, or the Zeki. So read into that what you want. It's a consolidated B-24 Liberator. It's actually a gift from the Indian Air Force, this one. But beautiful, often overlooked. Everyone thinks of the Lancaster, and then probably in the light bomber role, the Mosquito, possibly the Halifax, or the Sterling bomber if they're quite into their planes. But really, B-24 made up a lot of the numbers of the bomber fleet. Just turning very swiftly to this. This is one of the bouncing bombs. It was attached on those two ends, slung down, spun, and then when it was dropped from the bomb bay of a Lancaster, it landed spinning, so it would bounce along the top of the water, hit the wall of a dam and slide down. Now moving through to the last hangar here, this is the Age of Uncertainty. Certainly the gallery which has had the largest changes since the last time I was here. Has a good high level sort of geopolitical, not particular bit of technology, bit of culture, about 1980 onwards. And effectively here you're straight into the Eurofighter. I believe this is one of the Eurofighter prototypes. It's not a model, but it's it's still a plane that's in service. Here's one of the medical carts for recovering injured. There's an excellent explanation of how when someone's injured, within 18 minutes they're being treated, within an hour they're being put on a plane, within 24 hours they're being evacuated home, and in 24 hours anywhere in the world from being injured on the battlefield they should be in a UK hospital getting treated. They have the Seppacat Jaguar there. Very beautiful, striking aircraft attack. Some quite well-known bombs here. There's a paved way. And a series of different missiles and bombs that the RAF used and actually still use. Most of these are still in service today. And it will turn around. You can see the Eurofighter. You can actually see from the gallery at the top a very good view here, but unfortunately my battery ran out just before I reached that. I did film a bit more than I expected. Here's a Panvia Tornado, swing wing, multi-role attack, beautiful aircraft. A lot of these you'll remember from the Gulf War, first Gulf War. By the second Gulf War the Buccaneer here was gone. But you can see the swing wing Panvia Tornado, very effective jet with a Seppacat Jaguar above it. Both which kind of came out of service. There's the Buccaneer in the background, actually in the Gulf War colours. And down on the ground here, this is a runway denial of service weapon. So the idea is this series of cluster bombs. You basically fly down the middle of the runway and it fires off hundreds of projectiles. Some of them blow up straight away, some of them are anti-personnel, some of them are delayed fusers. So you effectively deny that runway for a few days. You can't just, it's not just there's a hole in it, you have to fill it in, but you actually have to be very careful working on the runway. The British signed up to a treaty to get rid of those, so we no longer use them. Certainly a very effective tool if you're in war. And here's the Buccaneer. A very aged aircraft for the Gulf War, and they did go out of service quite after that. You can see it in that pink sand colour, which was typical of planes in the Gulf War. And you can get a little view in, but we'll go round the back in a minute and you can see huge air brakes. Very important aircraft for its era. As we turn around, there is the Harrier jump jet. Very important aircraft, still in service. I don't know if it's still in service with the US Marine Corps, but certainly very heavily used in the Falklands by the British. Ability to take off vertically and land, carry quite a bit of weapons, dogfight, very flexible aircraft with some quite unique capabilities. Over in this corner there's an airfield chapel, so when the RAF travel they take everything, and here's basically a shipping container which is also a chapel, so they can have religious services and it can just be landed, plugged in and off you go. And there's the Harrier jump jet from below. You can see there the vector thrusting engine, so air comes in the front through the engine, and then there's effectively 4 exhausts where it pushes the air out and they go through these vectors. So here it's at a 45 degrees, so it helps it take off and go forward, and then those can swivel and push the aircraft forward, so really can take off in the same space as a helicopter. And you see those stabilizer wheels coming down from the wing and a big air brake there. Here's the front of a Hercules. It's actually a US Air Force Hercules. Almost looks like a model. It's very slick. You can't really see any rivets. It's quite an interesting piece. But it shows you just the scale of it. It's a lovely piece to have there. Sadly, no Hercules here. And they are out of service with the RAF from the last couple of years. So maybe time to get one in one of the RAF museums. And here's a portion of the Chinook. So you can see inside the cabin. And you can actually see those are pictures. It's not the real control panel. Because as with the other aircraft, if the aircraft is remotely in service, everything useful is stripped from the inside. Here we have the Predator drone. It's the last aircraft we're looking at today. There's a lot going on. They've moved a lot around, and some aren't readily accessible at the moment. But it really is an excellent collection of about 100 aircraft. And if you've reached the 1 hour 10 mark on both video, you've obviously liked your aircraft, and you should definitely visit RAF Hendon. It's very easy to get to, it's free, and it is an excellent collection of very well maintained, important and significant aircraft. So yeah, please go and have a look. I go every year pretty much, and always something new to see.